This is a bit of a sales pitch for enlightenment, but I wanted to talk about sort of the fruits of this uh, journey, you could say, because a lot of what we talk about are the sort of nuts and bolts of dealing with um, the issues that come up for the personal self and seeing through those. So sometimes it can feel like an arduous journey, and I thought it'd be good to just get our head up above the trees and see the broader landscape of where this journey really takes us. So in the past, I've mentioned occasionally that in some sense there are two broadly defined ways to access the divine. Okay, one, yeah, I think in medieval Christianity they were referred to as via positiva, via negativa, the positive path and the negative path. One's not preferable to the other, they're just two different paths. They both ultimately lead to the same place, but the approaches are quite different. So, and they both have some advantages and some disadvantages or challenges to them. Um, and some of us may feel more inclined to one path and others more inclined to the other. But the positive path is really the um, direct longing for the divine, where our attention is focused on um, uh, bringing us to a higher state through, worshiping the divine, music, chanting, um, a sense of adoration of the divine, um, sort of with the object of almost becoming God intoxicated, right? Just turning away from the world and just focusing on elevating ourselves directly to a sense of union with the divine. Okay, this is, in some sense, what the monastic tradition was about, to be able to devote one's entire energy towards that direction. Away from the world of form, away from the world of obvious, pleasures and excitement and adventures, and focus all of that energy towards our direct gaze on heaven, you could say. Okay, that's in some sense it's very uplifting, so that it can have a lot of appeal. The one sort of significant disadvantage is that it tends to override any sort of personal egoic issues that may still be operating. It's almost like just try to put them out of your mind and focus your entire energy on accessing the divine. The problem is that the egoic self has an incredible ability to resurrect insistently, to come back in moments of weakness or tiredness or inattention, to come back in ways that we may have thought we had left behind. So in that way, it can have this sort of gravitational effect to pull us back down away from this sense of higher attainment, right? Higher states, bliss, um, you know, joy, um, just that movement upward. So these egoic traits that may not have been looked at previously can have these incursions into our spiritual life that we thought we had under control, and we're making advances. So you can um, see this sometimes in seekers that have tried to be too good for too long, and then the shadow side that's always been there sort of has been kept under wraps to the extent that at some point it just explodes into um, the current reality for that person. You can also see it in relatively commonly in preachers and gurus that suddenly there's while they preach purity, suddenly something is revealed that um, there's a darker side, having to do with sex or power or money. Usually one or more of those big three. Right? So this is something where we've really tried to manage our experience, manage our mind, and try to push away things that we don't want to see or look at, trying to just leapfrog over them. Um, and the difficulty is they often come back and bite us. So, I mean, that's the disadvantage. So on the negative side, the way it's dealt with is to look at those issues first, really get to know the self, our human self, the way our mind works, to get a real good look at that, to see how that operates. Um, from the point of view that if we understand it, then we can move beyond it. If we understand it, then it loses its power over us, where it might otherwise have in the past pulled us into acting unconsciously, right? So the negative path is sort of, in Sanskrit, it's typically rendered as neti neti, which means not this, not that. And it's the process of, really looking at our own identity and realizing that, I'm not my possessions, I'm not my opinions, I'm not my concepts, I'm not my beliefs, I'm not my feelings, and ultimately not even my body. Um, so it's actually a process of subtraction where we eliminate, not that those things aren't relatively true, that are part of our relative experience, but they're not ultimately true. So it's sort of identifying what we're not and discarding that out of an understanding of it. And that sometimes just takes experience and situations and errors. There's a Zen story. Somebody asked the Zen master, how he came to, deep realization. And the Zen master said, one mistake at a time. I like that. So that's this process of this negative path. So it's not, positive isn't better than negative in this case. It's just two different directions. Again, both end up at the same place. Um, but this negative path has the advantage of when we work our way through it, then we are able to access awareness um, at will. We just recognize that it is our true nature. Unlike the positive path of trying to raise ourselves up to heavenly states, we're not dependent on feeling, right? We're not dependent on, whether I'm having, a right experience, because that can be misleading sometimes too. Um, when we look at the operation of the ourselves directly, we get to know that to the extent that what we are not can be dropped. It's not like we have to try to discharge it out of dislike or annoyance or anything. We just see that it's not actually who we are fundamentally. That's the understanding of it. Once that's understood, then it just loses power by itself. So we don't actually have to drop anything by human willpower. Our job is to see through it. And when we've seen through everything that we're not, what's left is the essential. What's left is the divine, right? Not the individual human, but what we're left with is a direct recognition of our essential self as awareness. So it's not the personal self that attains divinity, it's the recognition that what we are and what we've always been is this awareness, which is a manifestation of Source and therefore not other than Source. So we recognize that what we are fundamentally is and has always been, in that sense, divine from the get-go, from as far back as we can remember. We realize it's never been absent. So that's most generally found in Eastern religions, this idea of what we are and what everybody is essentially this untainted purity of awareness that we just may not see because it's sort of over covered with beliefs and thoughts and opinions about who we are, etc. So the idea is just to peel away what isn't true and what's left is already there. The positive approach is that, we're trying to sort of gain something beyond what we are now, sort of access unity with the divine, which is tend to viewed as somehow above us, in the heavens, not necessarily here already. So it's seen much more as an attainment. And then what's seen to hold us back from that journey is our own faults, right? Which can be interpreted as sin, right? Sin, that which prevents me, damages me somehow from reaching my goal. Okay, and in the positive path, which is more found in Western religions, the solution to that is, prayer and forgiveness and penance. So the movement from the positive path is me as a, poor human, trying to elevate myself, through my devotion to something worthy of union with the divine. Okay, so most of what I talk about is actually the negative path, and the reason for doing that is that it deals with this more of the shadow side of our personal structure, more than just trying to bypass it and elevate ourselves through different techniques. That feels good, but I find that once we know how to recognize that awareness, which is already fully present, fully developed, it's not like it, we have to improve it. We have to recognize it. So once we can see through the personal structure enough to recognize that awareness, then we can find it anytime. It's never, and eventually we realize it's never absent. And then eventually we recognize it is what we are, not a place that we visit, but it is actually what we are. Awareness, having a human experience. So in that sense, it's, in my opinion anyway, it's more predictable and more sustainable in a sense, because when it's recognized, it can be seen as present without requiring effort. So we're not trying to hold anything at bay. We're not trying to elevate ourselves above something. We're allowing whatever arises to arise, and have the opportunity to learn from it and move on. Okay, so that's just very, broadly these two different avenues. Like I say, one's not actually better than the other. Some people may prefer one rather than the other, but they both lead to the same place. And where they lead to, we could call this fullness of being. So this fullness is ultimately, whichever path we choose, we'll need to address the other side as well. Otherwise, we end up with, love without wisdom, or wisdom without love. Either way, it's a partial view. Okay, so the movement, the negative path is more in the direction of wisdom. The positive path more in the direction of love initially, but to fully embrace that love, then wisdom is required. And conversely, to fully embrace the wisdom, love is required, right? So as we come to the fullness of being, the other view needs to be incorporated. And we find that out at that time. So if we come to that fullness of being from this negative path through the process of elimination, it's odd to think that through elimination we come to a place of fullness, right? When things are, you could say, fully emptied, what we find out is there's a fullness there. It's paradoxical, but that's the sense of it, and that sense really comes from understanding what that awareness is. We don't understand it like a concept or an idea, but just being able to live from it and recognize the immensity of it, really. And when we recognize it in ourself, we can see, hopefully, that it's not personally generated. It may feel like that at first, but when we really look into it, we can see that it is intimate, couldn't be more intimate, and yet it's impersonal too. It's impersonal because it's universal. It's the one awareness functioning through this body, mind, and yours also. So it's impersonal in that sense, and yet for each of us, it couldn't feel more intimate. So that's why in Eastern religions, what would be called in Western religions God, in Eastern religions, they might refer to it as self with a capital S. Confusing, huh? And so there's the little self, and then there's the ultimate self. But it's really to inform us in a way that although it is that ultimate sense, It has the intimacy of self, not a personal separate self, but just um, ultimate subjectivity, you could say. Okay, so there's certain characteristics of this fullness of being, right? One of them is a sense of completion, right? It's not completion as in there's nothing left to learn, but there's completion in the sense of every moment feels complete, you know, complete in the sense of um, nothing, nothing more needs to be added to it. Complete in the sense of there's not a residual longing for something to be better at some future point in time. Also complete in the sense that it's like the one essential task in this life has been completed, and that being to find out who we are. When that task is completed, there's a sense that if I died tomorrow, it would be okay. What I came here to find out has been found out. There's a sense of completion. It's not it's not that we don't enjoy the next moment and then the next day, but there's not the sense of there's something undone, there's something incomplete, there's something um, unfinished, and yet there's still always more to learn. That never seems to have an end point. So this is the basis for the um, expression always being and always becoming, always being what we've always been as is, and always becoming, always learning, always um, growing, always understanding things at a more and more subtle level. But at each point, it feels complete, ironically. There's also just a deep sense of contentment. I know contentment doesn't sound quite as inspiring as, say, bliss, but and it feels like bliss when we first truly experience it, first truly encounter that fullness of being. It does feel blissful, and it can last a good long while. You know, we try to stretch out that feeling as long as we can, but this ultimately it settles down into contentment. And I suggest that the reason for that sense of bliss initially is that it's a relief. It's a relief of a burden that we didn't know we were carrying. You know, the burden being, trying to hold this personal self together, trying to make do, trying to manage, trying to make everything be okay, trying to navigate in the world. It's a lot of work. Right? And when that sense drops away, there's bliss, right? It's like carrying a, big pack of rocks on your back, and, you might be used to it, but when you take it off, it feels good. So the initial experience might be bliss, but eventually it settles down to contentment, which is very nice. Um, it's not mind-blowing bliss. It's not actually an altered state. It is our natural state. What most of us have spent most of our life living is an altered state. When we look back at it, our prior life from the perspective of awareness, it's like we remember it, but it's somewhat hard to believe that we actually live that life. Doesn't quite seem like us, although we know that it was. Okay, there's also a sense of union or oneness, union with the existence. Um, and a lot of us try to attain that, right? I certainly did, trying to look for oneness. Where is it? And what was realized eventually is that oneness is how things are, how everything already is, when we're not trying to manipulate it, not trying to manage it, we're not trying to get something for ourselves, we're not trying to, you know, arrange life to our preferences. All of that effort is sort of like shaking a bottle of muddy water and hoping that it'll get clear. The unity that we seek is only obscured by our mental activity. Without the mental activity, searching, seeking, trying, hoping, striving, efforting, without that activity, like the muddy water, things settle down. And then it is as it is. Everything is already one existence. So it's not a matter of trying, as an individual separate self, trying to merge with that tree, right? Because that whole, human efforting, starts off from a presumption of separation. So it won't happen. It doesn't happen that way. It's just, a simple recognition that is how life already is. And when we're not disturbing that view with our mental activity, opinions and beliefs, etc., it's seen not as a vision, it's just seen as the reality of it. Another thing that happens is that there's just a loss of shame, guilt, and regret. It's not like we can't remember the instances that may have caused those kind of residual feelings. We can remember them, but we can also see that they were a result of conditioning, experience, inattention, immaturity. So that's to say that doesn't mean that we whitewash the experience or pretend that we didn't have any involvement in it. But it gives us enough detachment to look at it clearly, to see what actually happened. Maybe even be grateful for the other person's participation in our learning experience. See it clearly, and move on. Right? So what we can see is that whatever happened, but it is no longer happening in this moment, except to the extent that we dredge it up out of memory and replay the tape. So if we learn what we can learn from it, and have a reasonable degree of remorse for our role, whatever it was that we may have played in that, that's okay. But it doesn't have that sticky quality anymore. It can be seen as something that happened, yes, but it's no longer no longer who I am. Something that I learned from, something that happened, yes, something that I have a decent amount of regret for maybe having hurt someone else. But it was done out of doing the best I could at the time with what I knew, right? For all of us. So again, it's not to whitewash it. We can learn something from it, but it no longer has that sticky, dark quality of something that's tainted our entire life. That's what drops away. We can just see it as something that happened, but it no longer um, affects what I may know myself to be now as awareness, which is as untainted as ever. There's, of course, just a sense of relaxation and serenity, right? It's like, you know, sort of being at home in the world, being at home in my own skin, being comfortable. There's someone, I forget who it was, actually described enlightenment as, you know, coming home after an arduous journey, long day of effort, coming home, sitting in an easy chair, putting your feet up in front of the fire, relaxing, right? Not a um, mind-blowing, blissed out event, just serenity, relaxation, because there's a sense of no longer um, demanding that life be different, right? No longer hoping that some point in the future there will be an event that will change everything, that will make sense of everything, right? No longer, trying to be the manager of my life and maybe other people's lives. You know, anybody done that? Trying to be the manager? How about the policeman? Being the policeman, being the judge, being the victim. So all these roles that we can fall into where we're trying to manipulate life to our benefit, all of that effort, that uncertainty, that trying, that hoping, that desire, all of that falls away. It's just seen as unnecessary because what is present is sufficient. It is complete already. So there's not that need to sort of gain some sense of value from situations and other people around us. Okay, there's also this, I've talked about it frequently, this shift of identity to, from a sense of separate individual personal self as a primary identity, even though I can occasionally visit awareness, that at some point the what we take ourselves to be shifts resonance to awareness, right? So that is how we see ourselves. What I am is awareness. I can look back at the body and the mind and the thoughts and still function through this body mind, which is surprising in a way, that it does that quite seamlessly. But there's this shift of identity so that things that may happen to this, our personal self, just the normal issues that we encounter during life, um, we still have to deal with them, but they just don't seem so serious anymore because ultimately they don't pertain to what we essentially are. We can still function probably much better than we ever did before because we're not so personally engaged in it. The awareness can function through the body minds quite seamlessly, quite actually magically. So we can, life can seem to have just a greater flow to it. We're able to deal with things that come along. Um, but there's also a loss of interest in um, running around trying to gain um, pleasure for this body mind. The excitement, the excitation, the physical pleasures. Those kind of things just um, lose interest. I mean, at some point in, well, certainly my life, and I'm guessing most people's life, that was the primary source, primary movement, was to gain, um, personal achievement, you know, you know, um, experiences that I valued, sensory experiences of all kinds. Um, all of that movement loses its power over us, and we're not driven in that same sense, um, because that sense of just quiet joy in being in whatever moment we find ourselves is sufficient. So there's not this uh, drive to acquire things for this body mind. Um, there's a sense of freedom too. Um, I say oddly because one of the last things that we are all willing to give up is this sense of personal will. I want what I want, right? And that sort of clenching, So when that um, personal will is eroded away, let's say, you would think that there would be less freedom, but it doesn't feel like that. Um, you know, it because the sense of it is that we come into harmony um, with life rather than our own preferences, which um, might often be opposed to what life is presenting to us. Um, so when we come willingly into a greater harmony with whatever's happening, um, we're actually participating in the freedom of life itself, right? It's not a personal freedom where I get to do whatever silly thing I want. It's really coming into alignment so that we're participating in the unfolding of life, which is a immensely free, creative process. There's also, I think for many of us, there's a sense of somehow wrongness or unworthiness that is carried at some level. And for most of us, we don't even know why or where that originated from. And the usual solution to it is, well, I'll just do something to make myself feel more worthy, right? But that movement to sort of compensate for an underlying sense of unworthiness or wrongness or insufficiency, or somehow I'm somehow deficient as a human. Anybody ever felt that? So it's not like there is ever or will ever be something that we can do that will permanently obliterate that sense of unworthiness. Because that effort to make myself worthy is still the same game, still the same unworthy, worthy game, still a sense of self-judgment. When we recognize that what we truly are is awareness, we realize that the awareness itself is already non-judgmental, never has been. The mind may be judgmental, certainly, but the awareness itself is not. So suddenly to recognize that what we truly are is awareness, we just step out of that whole paradigm. It's not like we've resolved it in any way. We just realize that it's a total mental creation, literally unworthy of our concern. Right? It just ceases to be an issue. It's not like that we've resolved it. It just is no longer relevant. Quite surprising, actually. But it does free us up to do things that we never thought we could do. We can surprise ourselves with what we can do when we aren't carrying around a mental image of what we can and can't do. And there's also there's a kind of knowingness um, that comes with this recognition of what we actually are. It's not a knowingness like we have access to some special database that we know lots of stuff. It's not that at all. Actually, the sense is that we know far less than we used to think that we knew. We used to really highly value information, data, right? Having opinions. But from awareness, there's much more the sense of living in the unknown without that being a negative thing. It's actually a freeing thing. We're not sort of clommed up with knowing more than we need to know. But the sense of it is that when we do need to know something, I don't mean facts or figures, but when we need to know what to say or how to act, that is available. It may not be available 10 minutes before or 5 minutes after, but in the moment that something is needed, there seems to be the knowingness of what may be appropriate in that moment. It's not a perfect system, obviously, but it is. That's the sense of it. Otherwise, it's it's like a lightning strike in the dark sky. The sense of living in the unknown and being okay with that. It's actually being in the unknown actually opens the aperture, right? It gives us availability to whatever might arise. When we're operating from an agenda or from an opinion or from a set of beliefs or dogma, then we're closed, right? We've got a certain set of ideas that we're trying to cram reality into. This feels different. This feels just much more open. And I would say, lastly, there are probably other aspects here that I haven't talked about tonight, but I'll just end with one that is really significant, and that is the loss of fear. So we can just sense into how life would feel to move in life without fear. And I can only say that sense happens again from awareness, because there is a direct recognition that awareness itself is beyond harm. It's not of this world. It's not a thing, right? Anything, any body, any thought structure, all can be subject to either physical or psychological harm. Awareness will be present for whatever happens, and it is unharmed by whatever happens. Just like the mirror in your bathroom is unharmed, um, you know, whether you show up with a happy face or an unhappy face, it still will be there for the next moment, absolutely untainted. Right? It's the same for awareness. And there's when that sensation is recognized deeply enough, um, there's something about that sense of fear, anxiety, um, restlessness that drops away. So this path that we're talking about, this um, path of seeing through the um, structure of the personal self, the ego doesn't like it. You know, the ego would much prefer to just feel good, and um, and that's fine. That's fine too. Um, but the ego's resistance can be expressed any number of ways. I mean, it can be sleepy, can be bored, can be argumentative, can be restless, can be conceptualizing, can be opinionated. That's lots of defenses, right? Um, but if we understand that that is the nature of ego, to protect its domain, that it's we've given it um, responsibility for, uh, it doesn't like when it feels like its job is in danger. So it has lots of tricks. And we can observe that. I don't see that as something wrong. I see it as something very instructive, to watch, to watch the just sheer cleverness of the ego doing its thing to um, protect itself. It's just a collection of thoughts. It's not actually a entity in there somewhere. It's just a pattern of thoughts. But that pattern of thoughts can react when we go to investigating its ultimate unreality. Doesn't like that. So that's just two very broad approaches, both leading to the sense of fullness of being. Um, but uh, coming to that sense of fullness of being, there we can also get caught there, um, and either path can end up feeling like I finally arrived and I don't want to go back. I'm just going to hang out in this transcended state, and feels good, and I'm just going to stay there. Whether we arrive there through um, devotion to the divine or investigating the self, both cases we can end up with a sense of having um, arrived at a state of peace, of recognition, um, but it's still not the end of the story. Um, and this is actually the purpose of the Bodhisattva vow, right? Not allowing oneself to attain full enlightenment, whatever that is, um, before all other sentient beings have awoken, right? But what I take that to be is really, like a lot of spiritual teachings, is really to plant a seed so that when the time comes, that seed will sprout. And in this case, the time that it needs to sprout is having attained a transcendent state and feeling the allure of remaining sort of above the fray. Um, that teaching is a reminder that there's still a world out here. Okay. And what remains is, you could call it service, I suppose, as long as it's not taken as something that you're doing to gain merit, or you're doing because you should for to comply with some religious teaching. Um, it, it really feels just more like sharing in abundance for no particular reason. You may not even know why you're doing it, but perhaps there is some feeling of a sense of gratitude of having received this immense gift of um, recognition of what we are, some sense of wanting to share that. Not share it from a elevated space, sharing it from a space of we are all that already. So there's no higher, lower, helping. It's just a sharing of abundance.